The first time I saw a spark float upward instead of falling, I thought it was just bad welding. Then it moved. Slow, deliberate, like it was alive. Out here on Rig 19, hundreds of miles from shore, we live by 11 rules that keep us breathing and sane. Nobody jokes about them anymore. Not after what happened last winter. I remember the night I broke one of them. I was working alone, surrounded by metal and sea, when the lights flickered and the air started to hum. That was the moment I realized these rules aren't meant to protect us from the rig. They're meant to protect the rig from us. I learned Rule 1. Never weld after midnight. The sparks don't cool down during my very first week aboard Rig 19. When I thought the older crew were exaggerating, just trying to scare the newbies, the wind up here never truly stops, and the ocean below never forgives. But that night the silence between both felt heavier than the steel around me. The lights along the catwalk flickered in a rhythm that didn't match the generator's hum, and I kept telling myself it was nothing more than a loose wire. It always starts with excuses. That's how everyone rationalizes breaking a rule they don't fully understand. We had been running behind schedule after a storm tore through the upper deck, and when the foreman instructed me to finish welding reinforcement plates, I ignored the time. The sky above was black glass, the waves invisible except for the foam that glowed faintly whenever lightning cracked the horizon. Every strike of the arc torch reflected in my visor like tiny suns, and for a fleeting moment it felt almost beautiful. Then I noticed one spark drift upward, defying gravity and pulse once like a heartbeat, as if it was alive. I killed the torch, expecting darkness, but the ember lingered, hovering toward a ceiling beam and pressing against the steel until it hissed and left a perfect black mark. The air temperature shifted suddenly, hot and sticky, making my gloves cling to my palms. The radio on my belt emitted static shaped almost like a whisper. "You're over time," it said in a voice low and slow, neither male nor female. My first instinct was to assume someone on the rig was playing a prank, but every channel was dead, every intercom line silent. The walkway behind me groaned under the wind, a drawn-out vibration traveling up through my boots. I turned expecting a coworker, but the deck was empty except for the faint shimmer of the embers in the torch's light. I tried to log it in my mind as a trick of fatigue or imagination, but the moment the spark floated closer, curiosity and dread coiled tightly in my stomach. I backed away until the railing scraped my legs, and the taste of salt spray stung my mouth as I gasped. I told myself that if I reignited the torch, the normal flame would swallow the ember, make it harmless. As soon as the arc spat light, the single spark fractured into dozens of tiny glowing motes that danced across the floor grating, each leaving a trail of faint red light that refused to fade. They clung to the steel, sinking into it like the rig itself was swallowing them alive and deliberate. I heard the foreman shouting my name over the intercom, asking why the weld cameras were showing streams of red crawling along the deck. By the time I reached the control hatch, the metal beneath my boots felt hot enough to burn through my soles. Inside the maintenance corridor, every alarm on the control board flashed with random codes, temperature spikes, oxygen drops, pressure surges, none of them making sense. The engineer on duty grabbed my arm and demanded to know if I had been working past shift end. I nodded, feeling my voice catch in my throat, and his face went pale. "You broke the first rule," he whispered. "They don't cool down." He pulled me deeper into the corridor, slamming the bulkhead and bolting it, shaking as if the action alone could contain what was happening outside. Through the small viewport, I saw the deck glowing like molten metal. The heat shimmer formed vague shapes, limbs, faces, outlines of people trapped in the steel. The engineer muttered a prayer, eyes wide, and told me not to look again. "Once they start burning," he said quietly, "they remember who lit them." That night, I understood why the rig always smells faintly of scorched metal even when no welding is happening. The heat lingers, alive, marking every mistake. I didn't sleep until sunrise, and even then, the constant hum of the structure sounded like a slow heartbeat beneath my bunk. Every torch was inspected before the next shift, the clock above the tool rack painted in bright red to warn against late-night welding. Still, accidents continued, glowing scratches on the walls, machinery turning on by itself, heat blooming from places that should be cold. When I documented the event, the supervisor simply added it to the maintenance log. Operator #47, after hours welding. Sparks active for 26 minutes. Containment successful. The previous entry was 6 months old, implying someone had survived the same mistake before me. I stared at the names, wondering how many had been erased from memory, how many had disappeared quietly. The rig groaned again, deep and drawn out, like the hull itself was shifting, alive and aware of what had been done. In the days after, I began keeping my own private log, notes not shared with the company. Every light we produce stayed lit somewhere in the darkness, waiting. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night and see faint glowing embers drifting past my cabin window, impossible yet undeniable. One night, the torch I left on the bench flared briefly and then vanished, leaving the smell of scorched steel behind. That's when I realized the first rule wasn't just about safety, it was about survival, and I had only just begun to understand why. The older welders never spoke of it openly, but you could see the knowledge in their eyes, an unspoken agreement that after midnight, no spark dies. I watched them move through the rig as shadows, careful and deliberate, never breaking contact with the steel, never testing the air. I understood why we work in pairs, why even simple maintenance checks after nightfall are strictly supervised. Every ember we generate carries memory, intention, and judgment. It never forgets, never rests. When I returned to the welding station that night, the same deck that had looked solid hours ago seemed unfamiliar. The lights reflected in 100 angles, creating illusions of movement. Sparks began to float from even the untouched metal, tiny, insistent, forming patterns I couldn't decipher. I whispered under my breath, "Never weld after midnight," and even saying it aloud made the hairs on my neck rise. I didn't dare move my hands toward the torch, yet the deck called me, tempting me to finish what I had started. By the end of the shift, the entire rig seemed alive with heat and memory. Every metallic surface glowed faintly, every corner hummed with anticipation. I left the station sweating, feeling the weight of unseen eyes following me. I knew then that Rule 1, never weld after midnight. The sparks don't cool down was more than a guideline, it was a warning, a promise that the rig itself punishes mistakes and remembers every spark lit after darkness falls. And deep down I wondered how many had learned it the hard way before me, and who would be next. I immediately remembered Rule 2, never enter the restricted deck alone. The shadows remember faces. As I approached the heavy steel door leading to the upper deck, my heart hammering with the memory of last night's sparks. The wind howled off the ocean, rattling my helmet, and the shadows along the catwalk stretched longer and darker than they had any right to. Even the generator's hum seemed to falter under the oppressive weight of silence. I told myself it was superstition, that old crew members liked to scare new welders with stories. But the instinct in my gut whispered otherwise. The moment I stepped onto the restricted deck, the air felt different, heavier, thicker, almost sticky with a presence I couldn't see. The floor grate creaked beneath my boots, every step echoing unnaturally through the steel corridors. Shadows clung to the corners, pooling in ways that defied logic, and I could feel them tracing the outline of my body. Each movement I made seemed mirrored, twisted slightly, like the deck itself was learning the shape of my face. I cursed my curiosity and reminded myself that the rule wasn't just a warning, it was survival. I edged toward the inspection point, hands trembling on the railing, helmet lights barely penetrating the gloom. Shapes flickered just beyond my vision, elongated limbs, shifting forms that didn't align with any human figure. I tried to focus on the task, check the cables, note the panel voltages, ensure the deck was structurally sound. Yet my eyes kept darting to the shadows, and each time I did, they shifted faster, almost as if aware of my attention. My pulse quickened, the whispers in the wind felt deliberate, and the steel underfoot seemed to thrum in response. Halfway across the deck, I saw the first figure, It had vague human proportions, but no discernible features, a dark smear against the dim light, and I froze. I thought about calling for help, about running back, but my voice caught in my throat. The shadows moved in tandem, slipping along walls and beams, aware of every step I took. I realized with horror that the rule wasn't just superstition. The shadows cataloged anyone who dared enter alone, learning and remembering every detail of their face, body, and movement. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, the stress of the rig playing tricks on me, but the deeper I went, the thicker the darkness became. The panel I had come to inspect was faintly glowing in the corner, not from the lights, but from the heat radiating through the steel itself. Every weld I had completed earlier flickered in my mind, sparks from the previous night dancing through my vision. I remembered the older welder's warnings. One spark alone can burn, but alone on this deck, you were already cataloged. A sudden scrape of metal made me flinch, my knees nearly buckling. Shadows converged in the corners, pooling and stretching unnaturally. I could feel them pressing toward me, patient and deliberate, measuring my fear and hesitation. The catwalk narrowed ahead, and the steel beneath my boots felt warmer, almost alive, as if feeding on the memory of past trespassers. I wanted to turn back, but the path I had taken seemed unfamiliar now, warped by the presence of the shadows. My own reflection in the visor appeared distorted, elongated, and for a moment I feared the shadows might replace me entirely. I reached the inspection panel and forced myself to focus on the wiring. Sparks from the previous night's welding flickered faintly in my mind, warning me not to overreach. The cables were functional, but the shadows lingered, coiling around corners and pooling beneath beams, as though waiting for me to slip. I whispered to myself, repeating the rule like a mantra, though the words offered little comfort. Every corner I glanced into seemed to hold a lurking shape, some outline of a face I had never seen, but somehow knew belonged to someone who had disobeyed before me. Time became meaningless as I moved along the deck. My breathing was shallow, my heart racing, and the shadows followed, waiting, remembering. I could feel their presence pressing against my chest, a weight that made each step harder than the last. I wondered how many faces they had cataloged, how many crew members had wandered alone, only to be remembered for the rest of the rig's life. I dared not stop, afraid that pausing would make them closer, more insistent. The deck wasn't just steel and machinery anymore. It was memory, fear, and patient observation. A sudden vibration ran through the catwalk, low and deliberate, like the heartbeat of the rig itself. I spun toward it and saw multiple figures, human-like yet featureless, moving in the shadows. They were not attacking, only observing, learning, cataloging, and I realized the full meaning of the rule. Alone, I was a target for their memory, and every hesitation, every glance, every tremor of fear was recorded. I forced my legs forward, counting each step, whispering reassurances to myself that this was temporary, that I would survive. When I finally reached the safety of the main deck, the shadows receded slightly, but their presence lingered in the corners of my vision. The air felt lighter, but I could still feel them watching, remembering, cataloging the outline of my face for later. I knew then that the rule was more than caution. It was a law of survival, an unspoken warning that the rig's shadows never forgave, never forgot. I vowed never to walk this deck alone again. Every shadow I had passed was patient, eternal, and aware. Even weeks later, I can feel them following, waiting in the dark corners, pressing against my peripheral vision when I enter the upper decks. Each shadow holds a memory, a trace of every person who dared defy the rule. The older welders never joke about it, their eyes dark with unspoken fear. I know now that Rule 2, never enter the restricted deck alone. The shadows remember faces as absolute, and breaking it is a mistake no one survives twice. And still, sometimes, when the rig creaks, I feel a presence brushing against my shoulder, reminding me they have not forgotten me. I never fully understood Rule 3. Never ignore the pressure alarms. The rig feeds on complacency. Until the night, the generators hummed unevenly, and the air inside the rig thickened with a metallic tang. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Tiny vibrations under my boots, a shiver in the steel beams, the faintest echo of air, moving where it shouldn't. I brushed it off, convinced I was still rattled from the shadows on the restricted deck. But the alarms weren't just instruments. They were warnings, screaming in frequencies. My mind instinctively understood, even if my rational thoughts refused to. The first siren sounded low and intermittent, like the rig itself was sighing, trying to warn me before the situation escalated. I rubbed my eyes and checked the panels. Nothing unusual appeared at first glance, only the standard pressure readings flickering across the monitors. I should have immediately called the engineer, followed the protocol, but fatigue and overconfidence whispered that it was nothing, that the rig was settling after the storm, as if the steel itself were stretching and sighing. That whisper of complacency was exactly what the rule warned against. I climbed the ladder to the secondary control deck, boots clanging against the grating as the vibration intensified beneath me. The alarms were sharper now, pulsing in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, like the rig was feeding on my hesitation. My helmet lights reflected off the metal walls, casting long, irregular shadows that seemed to stretch toward me, following each step. I could feel the heat from the lower decks rising in waves, the air thick with pressure, and a dull ringing started in my ears. I cursed myself for ignoring the first faint alarm, and realized the rig remembered, cataloging each slip in my focus, each ounce of distraction. The main pressure gauge on the central panel jumped suddenly, a red arc slicing across the dial. My fingers trembled as I reached for the override controls. Each second counted, and yet the rig seemed to slow time, every tick stretching endlessly. A low rumble echoed through the structure, vibrating my teeth, and I realized the magnitude of my error. Ignoring these alarms wasn't just foolish, it was dangerous, a provocation. The steel itself seemed to tense in anticipation, as though testing me, waiting to see if I would act decisively or falter. I took a deep breath and activated the emergency vent, but the panel resisted, screens flickering wildly, alarms overlapped, a cacophony of high-pitched bleeps and low thrum, each one a pulse against my chest. The lights flickered, throwing the control deck into partial darkness, shadows twisting unnaturally along the walls. I gritted my teeth and kept moving, checking valves and monitoring gauges, sweat stinging my eyes. Every tool I touched felt heavier than normal, as if the rig was aware, imposing weight and consequence for each fraction of hesitation. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each one a test of my composure. I kept telling myself, don't ignore them, don't let complacency take hold. Yet my rational mind tried to argue with instinct, whispering that I could handle it, that I'd survived storms, mechanical failures, and even the haunting shadows on the restricted deck. But I felt the pressure not just in the pipes and gauges, but in the very air itself, thick, almost alive, pressing down on my shoulders, on my chest, on my skull. The rig feeds on complacency, the rule said, and I could feel the words echoing in every vibrating beam around me. A sudden hiss of escaping air made me jump, and I saw a valve glowing faint red, heat spreading along the pipe like molten metal. I approached it cautiously, heart hammering, hands shaking as I turned the release wheel. The pressure didn't drop. It surged, pushing against the floor and walls with a force I could feel in my bones. I stumbled back, barely holding onto the railing, as the lights overhead flickered in sync with the alarm's pulse. It was as if the rig were alive, testing me, demanding my full attention, punishing my earlier lapses. I realized then that ignoring the alarms was more than a mistake. It was a declaration of defiance against the rig itself. It remembered, and it would not forgive easily. Every fluctuation of pressure, every spike on the monitor, felt like a lash, marking my presence, teaching me the consequence of complacency. I could hear the metal groaning, echoing with memory, responding to the smallest movements I made. Shadows danced across the walls, distorted reflections of the alerts and the pressure surges, twisting reality in ways my brain struggled to process. By the time I stabilized the system, my hands were raw, my muscles screaming, and my helmet was fogged with sweat. The rig hummed steadily again, but the oppressive awareness remained. I knew that even though the immediate threat had been managed, the lesson had been etched into my mind. The pressure alarms were not merely warnings, they were a language, a record-keeping system of the rig, reminding every operator that vigilance is survival. To ignore them was to invite observation, and the rig never forgot. I sat for a moment on the cold metal floor, chest heaving, listening to the steady hum of the generators. The shadows seemed calmer, retreating, but I could feel the memory of my hesitation embedded in the steel. I vowed silently that I would never let complacency creep in again, that I would obey the rule with absolute rigor. The rig fed on any lapse, and even though I had survived, I knew the consequence could have been far worse. Every vibration, every echo, reminded me that Rule 3, never ignore the pressure alarms. The rig feeds on complacency was absolute, and no operator escapes the rig's memory once it notices your negligence. Even days later, I could feel the memory of that night lingering in the rig. Every alarm, no matter how minor, triggered a knot of fear in my stomach. My coworkers joked about the sensitivity of the equipment, but I knew better. The rig observes, remembers, and punishes in ways you can feel but cannot always see. Complacency is a slow death here, and the shadows of the restricted deck, the heat of untamed sparks, and the pulse of the alarms all converge to make it clear. Disobedience has consequences, and the rig's memory is long. I left the control deck that night exhausted, my body trembling from adrenaline and fatigue. The lights reflected off the steel in a way that almost seemed alive, every beam and surface pressing a subtle warning into my mind. I thought about the faces cataloged on the restricted deck, the sparks that refused to cool, and now the pressure that had surged through the veins of the rig. Each rule, each warning, connected in a web of tension and observation. Breaking any one meant the rig noticed, remembered, and tested you in ways you couldn't predict. I never forgot Rule 4. Never leave the hatch open. The deep hears everything. The night I made the mistake of rushing through the lower deck after finishing my welding checks. The hatch leading to the maintenance tunnel was heavy and cumbersome, but in my exhaustion, I barely latched it. The wind from the ocean whipped through the rig, rattling the steel walls, carrying a faint, hollow echo from the depths below. I told myself it was just a draft, just the storm lingering in the water outside, but instinct whispered otherwise. The deep had a memory, a perception that far surpassed our human senses, and by leaving the hatch open, I had offered it a voice. The first minutes were subtle. A low hum reverberated through the hull, almost imperceptible, yet insistent. The steel floor seemed to vibrate under my boots, and shadows in the tunnel stretched and warped in ways that made my stomach knot. I should have closed the hatch immediately, should have obeyed the rule without hesitation, but the fatigue weighed on me heavier than the memory of previous rules. I felt a faint, almost imperceptible pressure, as though the water itself was pressing against the rig, testing the metal, testing me. I shivered and reminded myself of the rule aloud, a mantra to steady my fear. By the time I reached the far end of the tunnel, the vibrations intensified, subtle waves running along the bulkheads. My flashlight revealed only the steel walls and the narrow path ahead, yet I could feel eyes, countless unseen observers, cataloging my every movement. The deep listens, the rule had said, and now I knew it wasn't a warning for superstition. It was a survival mechanism. Every sound, every motion, even the smallest sigh of air through a pipe could be detected, and leaving the hatch open was an invitation for the rig to interpret, remember, and react. A sudden draft swept through the open hatch, carrying with it a scent of brine and decay, something not quite natural, almost sentient. The rig shivered with it, groaning in the steel like an animal disturbed. I froze, realizing that the hatch was no longer just a door, it was a bridge, a portal between the controlled environment of the rig and the incomprehensible darkness below. Every minute it remained open, I could feel the pressure of the deep, subtle, yet overwhelming, crawling into the corridors, whispering through the pipes, vibrating through the floors and walls. I tried to focus on routine maintenance tasks, but the air felt alive, carrying distant sounds that no human could generate. Every tool I touched seemed heavier, as though weighted with awareness. The shadows along the walls elongated, almost pooling toward the hatch, their forms shimmering unnaturally. My pulse accelerated, and I felt the first creeping tendrils of panic, a visceral fear that the deep below could hear me, cataloging not just my presence but my thoughts, my hesitation. Each vibration in the steel, each faint whisper of water against the hull, felt like an accusation. I approached the hatch cautiously, hands trembling, knowing that closing it properly was not just procedure but protection. The moment I reached for the latch, a shiver ran along the entire rig, subtle but undeniable, as if the deep itself was aware of my intention. The shadows in the corridor reacted instantly, moving in ways that defied logic, flickering against walls and ceiling in patterns I could barely comprehend. I gritted my teeth and pulled the hatch closed, forcing the mechanism to click fully into place, yet the sense of being watched did not dissipate. Even after the hatch was latched securely, the vibrations persisted, a low, insistent hum that seemed to emanate from below the metal flooring. My mind raced with the understanding that the deep had heard everything I had done while the hatch was open. Every sound, every motion, every sigh or hesitation had been cataloged, remembered. The rig seemed to breathe around me, alive with anticipation, and I realized that the rule was not merely about safety, it was about respect for the unseen, about acknowledging that the deep is always listening. I moved down the corridor to inspect other systems, but every step was heavy, calculated, deliberate. The air was thick, carrying a faint taste of salt and something metallic, like blood or rust. Shadows seemed to converge at angles I could not trace with my eyes, twisting and dancing across walls and ceilings in response to the vibrations from below. I whispered the rule to myself again, as though repeating it could restore balance. Never leave the hatch open. The deep hears everything. Saying it aloud was a small comfort, but it did not erase the memory the deep had already taken. As I finished my inspection, the subtle pressure began to ease, though a persistent hum remained. I knew that this was only temporary, a reprieve, because the deep does not forget. It listens continuously, cataloging mistakes, noting hesitation, storing every infraction for the rig to remember. Every hatch left ajar, every corner ignored, every subtle lapse in procedure becomes part of its memory. The rig is not merely steel and machinery, it is alive with the awareness of the deep, a vigilant observer that responds to the smallest acts of negligence. Walking back toward the central deck, I felt the weight of the lesson pressing on me like a tangible force. Each vibration, each whisper of air, each shadow along the corridor seemed to carry a memory of my failure. I understood that no human effort alone could undo it. The deep had recorded my misstep, and only obedience moving forward could minimize the consequences. The rig seemed calmer, but only superficially. The presence lingered, patient and persistent, a reminder that the rule had been broken once and would not soon be forgotten. I sat for a long moment in the control room, reflecting on the near miss. The hatch was closed, the system stable, yet I could feel the deep listening still, a subtle vibration in the metal under my boots, a whisper at the back of my mind. Every operator on the rig knew the rules intellectually, but only when you experience the deep's awareness do you truly comprehend them. That night, I swore never to leave a hatch open again, understanding the true weight behind Rule 4, never leave the hatch open. The deep hears everything, and the vigilance required to survive even routine tasks. Even now, months later, I can feel it. The hatch is closed, yet the memory of leaving it ajar lingers in my mind and in the rig itself. The deep listens, always, and the shadows remind me that mistakes are cataloged and complacency is never forgiven. The lesson is clear: the deep is patient, intelligent, and aware, and leaving the hatch open, even for a moment, is an invitation to consequences far beyond human comprehension. I could still feel the lingering hum from Rule 5. Never touch the bioluminescent cables. They remember every spark. As I approached the dimly lit maintenance corridor, where the cables ran along the walls like glowing veins, their faint light pulsed softly, illuminating the metal scaffolding in eerie blues and greens, almost hypnotic. The older welders had warned me countless times to keep my hands away, that even a careless touch could awaken memories stored in their phosphorescent strands. I had believed it to be metaphor, exaggeration to scare newcomers, until the first spark leapt from my tools and the cables reacted. The moment my gloved fingers brushed too close to the nearest cable, a shiver ran up the rig, subtle but unmistakable, and the glow intensified unnaturally, like the cables were feeding on my fear. Every inch of wiring seemed alive, quivering under a current I couldn't see but could feel pressing against my chest. My heartbeat accelerated, and instinctively I pulled back, but the cables pulsed again, leaving a faint trace of heat against my gloves. The rule wasn't superstition. The bioluminescent cables stored energy, memory, and intent, reacting to carelessness with terrifying precision. I inched along the corridor, careful to avoid any accidental contact, but the shadows cast by the cables stretched along the walls, twisting unnaturally with each pulse of their glow. Every spark from my welding torch or helmet light seemed to leave a mark on the cables, a residue of my presence. The rig vibrated faintly, almost approving of my caution, or maybe chastising my prior negligence. I whispered the rule to myself under my breath, a mantra meant to steady trembling hands and racing thoughts. A sudden flicker of light from one cable drew my attention, and I froze. The glow intensified in a specific section, and I could swear it was mimicking the motion of my fingers as I adjusted a valve nearby. My pulse quickened. The cables weren't passive. They observed, storing impressions of any spark, any touch. The older welders had spoken of shadows dancing along the wires when they had been disobedient, of subtle corrections, of heat and pressure that forced compliance. I hadn't believed it fully until that exact moment, when the bioluminescence seemed to respond to me, aware of my every movement. I backed away carefully, but the corridor felt narrower now, shadows of the glowing cables stretching and coiling along the walls and ceiling like sentient tendrils. Every spark I had made earlier seemed to replay in my mind, the cable's glow intensifying with each imagined contact. I realized that even unintentional mistakes could be remembered, stored, and if repeated, punished. My hands trembled as I gripped the railing along the catwalk, aware that one misstep could ignite not just the cables, but the rig itself. A hiss of steam from a nearby pipe made me flinch, and in the shadows, the cables seemed to react again, pulsing faster, brighter, with an almost audible hum. I tried to convince myself it was merely a reaction to heat, to environmental conditions, but deep down I knew better. The bioluminescent cables remembered, and the rig fed on this awareness, storing every spark, every careless motion, every flicker of inattention. The intensity of their glow pressed against my eyes, disorienting, reminding me of the magnitude of my negligence. I approached the junction box cautiously, careful not to touch any strand unnecessarily. Each cable hummed under the surface, their phosphorescence pulsing rhythmically, like a heartbeat that matched my own. I could feel the energy beneath my boots, through the steel floor, a faint vibration that reverberated along my spine. Even now, every small spark left a trace, a memory, and the rig's shadows seemed to follow my progress, anticipating my next motion. Every step was a negotiation with the memory of the cables, a test of vigilance, a rule I could not afford to ignore. As I worked through the maintenance checklist, the cable's glow occasionally flared, responding to something I could not see. I realized then that every spark I had ever created, every touch, every careless adjustment, had been recorded. The bioluminescent cables did not forget, and they did not forgive. Each pulse, each flicker, reminded me that disobedience, even unintentional, was stored, a subtle warning encoded into the energy of the rig itself. Shadows shifted along the walls, coiling around corners, reflecting the glow of the cables in ways that made my stomach tighten. Hours passed in the eerie luminescence, and every time I glanced at the wires, I felt their awareness pressing against me, a constant vigilance I could not escape. I kept repeating the rule to myself, a silent reassurance, yet the cables pulsed independently, as if verifying my compliance. My eyes watered from the glow, my muscles ached from tension, but I knew retreating to a dimly lit corridor would not erase the memory already taken. The bioluminescent cables had cataloged every spark I had produced in the previous days, embedding it into the energy of the rig, ready to respond to any future negligence. By the time I finished my inspection, my hands were raw from careful maneuvering, and my mind was frayed with tension. The corridor seemed calmer now, the glow steady, but I knew it was only a temporary lull. The cables never forgot, and the rig never stopped observing. Every operator who ignored this rule, even briefly, left an indelible trace. I had survived, but the lesson was seared into my consciousness. The rig fed on memory, on sparks, on carelessness, and Rule 5, never touch the bioluminescent cables. They remember every spark was not a warning, it was a law of survival. Even now, the faint glow of any cable anywhere in the rig makes my skin crawl, reminding me of the silent witness within the phosphorescent strands. Every spark is remembered, every touch is catalogued, and the shadows of the rig move in harmony with these memories. I never, under any circumstance, approach the bioluminescent cables casually. The rig remembers, and the rig punishes. Compliance is survival, and negligence is recorded, ready to demand attention in ways I am only beginning to understand. I could still feel the weight of Rule 6. Never ignore the emergency lighting. Darkness hides more than shadows. As I descended into the lower maintenance tunnels that night, the faint hum of the rig's backup generators, barely keeping the path illuminated. The main lights had failed intermittently after the storm, and only the red glow of the emergency strips guided the way. I had learned from previous mistakes, sparks, open hatches, cables, that the rig was alive in ways I could feel but not see. Darkness was never empty here. It remembered, watched, and waited. Every shadow that stretched along the walls seemed deliberate, anticipating my every step. The moment I stepped into the tunnel, the red emergency lights flickered in unison, casting long, angular shadows across the metal walls. My boots echoed softly against the steel floor, each sound magnified in the oppressive silence. The rule had always seemed like a precaution, but now I understood it was a shield. Darkness here did not simply obscure. It concealed awareness, intent, and forces that were neither mechanical nor human. I hugged the wall, moving carefully, listening to the faint creak of pipes above and the subtle vibrations beneath me, each one magnified in the low light. I tried to focus on my inspection, checking panels and scanning the structural supports, but the shadows seemed to stretch and pulse independently of the flickering emergency lights. Every corner looked deeper than it should, every opening a potential gateway. I remembered the previous rules, the bioluminescent cables, the hatch, the pressure alarms, and the pattern became clear. My pulse quickened as I realized that the mere absence of light was a medium through which the rig cataloged and observed. Halfway down the corridor, a faint scrape echoed softly from the far end, something small but deliberate. I froze, shining my helmet light toward it, but the beam barely penetrated the shadows. The emergency lights flickered again, momentarily plunging the corridor into near total darkness. In that instant, I could feel a presence, subtle but undeniable, pressing at the edges of my awareness. I whispered the rule under my breath, as though saying it aloud could ground me. Never ignore the emergency lighting. Darkness hides more than shadows. I continued cautiously, the red strips providing only fragments of visibility. Every shadow shifted as I moved, following me, sometimes stretching unnaturally along the walls, sometimes pooling in corners that my light could not reach. My hands trembled on the railing, not from fear alone, but from the realization that the rig's darkness was alive in its own way. It remembered every misstep, every lapse, every moment I had ignored warning signs. The emergency lights were not merely guidance. They were the only thing separating the human mind from the rig's concealed attentions. A sudden vibration ran through the floor beneath me, low and insistent, echoing along the steel corridors. I glanced at the panel meters. The systems appeared stable, but instinct screamed that the rig had taken notice. Shadows shifted at angles that made no sense, moving against the emergency light's glow, twisting and elongating as though independent of any physical object. My helmet light barely registered a glimmer in one corner, a movement too fluid to be mechanical, and I realized the truth. Darkness was a living medium here, hiding and remembering simultaneously. I pressed forward, cautiously checking each junction and valve, each step calculated to avoid triggering any latent memory of previous mistakes. The faint hum of the emergency light seemed almost alive, pulsing subtly in rhythm with my heartbeat. Every shadow I passed felt deliberate, cataloging my face, my stance, the tension in my shoulders. The rig remembered compliance as well as disobedience, and the emergency lighting was the lens through which it observed. One misstep, one moment of distraction, and the darkness could consume your awareness, leaving nothing but memory for the rig to hold. As I reached the far end of the tunnel, I caught movement again, a flicker in the corner of my vision, gone the instant I turned my head. The red glow cast everything in harsh, unnatural contrast, and I realized that even with lighting, the rig's presence could not be escaped. The shadows were not just visual anomalies, they were extensions of the rig's consciousness, cataloging, measuring and storing every interaction. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my temple as I whispered the rule to myself once more, a reminder to remain vigilant and to respect the light as a protective measure against the ever-present dark. I completed the inspection, moving carefully back toward the main deck, each step deliberate, watching shadows shift and pulse around me. The emergency lights flickered, but remained steady enough to maintain some semblance of safety. I understood then that darkness was more than absence. It was a conduit through which the rig observed and remembered. Ignoring the lighting was a signal to the rig that one was vulnerable, and in that environment, vulnerability was never forgiven. Even now, whenever I descend into the lower tunnels, I feel the echoes of that night pressing against my mind. Shadows linger at the corners of my vision, even in the presence of light, reminders that darkness hides far more than the human eye can perceive. Every flicker, every hum, every vibration is cataloged, remembered and responded to. The lesson of Rule 6, never ignore the emergency lighting. Darkness hides more than shadows is ingrained, etched in every memory of the rig, a perpetual reminder that obedience, vigilance, and respect for the light are the only things that keep the unseen forces of the deep at bay. I could feel the oppressive weight of Rule 7. Never override the cooling systems. Heat breeds the unseen the moment I descended into the engine bay. The air thick with humidity, and the faint metallic scent of overheated machinery. The storm outside had already stressed the rig, and I had foolishly thought that bypassing the automated cooling system would save time. But the older welder's warnings replayed in my mind, cautioning that heat is not just a physical hazard. It invites attention, and in this rig attention is never benign. The steel walls seemed to pulse subtly, vibrating with anticipation, as though the machinery itself were aware of my hesitation. The first sign that I had made a critical error came almost immediately. A low hum reverberated through the pipes, not mechanical but deliberate, a vibration that seemed to resonate with the warmth radiating off the engines. Shadows elongated along the ceiling and walls, flickering unnaturally as though reacting to the rising temperature. I told myself it was paranoia, the rig's oppressive atmosphere playing tricks on me, yet instinct screamed differently. The heat was alive, feeding something unseen in the metal corridors, something that measured my audacity and cataloged my misstep. Sweat trickled down my temples as I reached for the cooling bypass valve, the metal surprisingly warm under my gloved fingers. Every action felt magnified in the stifling heat, and the shadows seemed to lean closer, stretching unnaturally in the glow of the emergency lighting. I remembered the rule aloud, whispering to steady my shaking hands, Never override the cooling systems. Heat breeds the unseen, hoping repetition might shield me from the consequences of my reckless choice. But the heat was already spreading, thick and insistent, and I could feel the rig itself reacting to my interference. The temperature gauge surged, climbing faster than the control systems could compensate, and I stumbled back, narrowly avoiding a spray of steam from an overheated pipe. The shadows in the corners twisted, flickered, and pooled like living ink, stretching along the beams and walls in ways that no light source should have allowed. My breath came in ragged bursts, each inhale hot and heavy, mingling with the mechanical hum that seemed almost sentient. I realized then that the rule was not metaphorical. The rig could sense catalog and respond to heat, drawing unseen attention to any act of disobedience. I forced myself to move cautiously along the catwalk, checking secondary cooling valves, each step deliberate to avoid further disruption. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest, vibrating in response to my proximity. I glimpsed distorted reflections of shadows in the metal walls, flickering and merging with the heat shimmering off the pipes. Even the bioluminescent cables in adjacent corridors seemed to pulse faster, reacting to the rising temperature, their glow illuminating new forms in the darkness. The rig remembered each spark, each heat spike, and I could feel it observing, cataloging, waiting. As the systems began to stabilize, the shadows still clung to the corners, almost crawling along the beams and catwalks, unnervingly close. The warmth radiating from the engines made every breath a struggle, and I could feel a subtle vibration through the steel beneath my boots. Every shadow, every flicker of light, seemed deliberate, focused on me, as though the rig were calculating consequences for my failure. Heat, I realized, wasn't merely uncomfortable. It was a signal, a beacon that drew the unseen closer, making mistakes palpable, almost tangible. I reached the main cooling console and carefully restored the systems, listening to the mechanical whine settle into a steady rhythm. The oppressive heat began to ease, yet the shadows lingered, aware, patient, cataloging every misstep I had made in those few harrowing minutes. I could feel the rig exhaling, a subtle shift in the air that suggested both relief and lingering awareness. The lesson was seared into my mind. The unseen forces of this rig respond to negligence, and heat is their most sensitive instrument of attention. As I moved back toward the catwalk exit, the emergency lights flickered in subtle waves, casting elongated shadows that followed my every movement. The metallic floor beneath my boots pulsed faintly, a vibration almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable to someone attuned to the rig's rhythms. I kept whispering the rule to myself, a protective chant against both human error and the rig's sentient memory. Never override the cooling systems. Heat breeds the unseen. Saying it aloud seemed to calm the rig slightly, but I could still feel the lingering tension, the heat lingering in the shadows, a reminder of my folly. Even after leaving the engine bay, I could feel the consequences of my action. The corridors seemed warmer, the shadows heavier, stretching and pooling with a deliberate awareness. Every operator who ever ignored this rule had left a trace, and the rig remembered. It responded not violently, but insidiously, cataloging each lapse and waiting for the next. Compliance was survival. Negligence was etched into the steel itself, feeding the unseen that thrived in warmth, shadows, and the memory of sparks. Sitting in the control room later, exhausted and tense, I reflected on the narrow escape. The heat was gone, the cooling system stabilized, yet I could feel the rig's watchful presence, subtle vibrations and shadows, reminding me that observation is constant, memory persistent, and the unseen never sleeps. Rule 7. Never override the cooling systems. Heat breeds the unseen had been reinforced not as a suggestion, but as a law, a principle of survival that would not forgive carelessness. I swore to myself that I would never risk it again, understanding that every neglected procedure leaves an indelible imprint, a memory the rig never forgets. Even now, the faint warmth of any overheated panel or mismanaged system sends a shiver down my spine. Shadows seem to stretch more eagerly in response, and the vibrations under my boots hum with the memory of mistakes past. Heat draws the unseen closer, and the rig waits patiently, silently reminding anyone who dares disobey that vigilance is survival and negligence is catalogued forever. I had always heard whispers among the crew about Rule 8. Never enter the machinery pit without backup. Echoes of the lost follow you. But until that night, I never truly understood its weight. The machinery pit was a cavernous space at the heart of the rig, where turbines hummed and massive engines churned, hidden shadows pooling between every beam and pipe. I descended alone, flashlight in hand, convinced that my familiarity with the layout would be enough. The moment my boots echoed across the grated floor, I felt the difference, an oppressive presence that seemed to ripple in the air, subtle yet undeniable, as if unseen eyes catalogued my every step. The pit was colder than expected, the hum of the turbines amplified in the steel cavern, vibrating through my chest. Shadows clung to every corner, moving in ways that defied light and logic, stretching unnaturally with the flicker of my flashlight. I remembered the rule, whispering it under my breath to steady my racing pulse. Never enter the machinery pit without backup. Echoes of the lost follow you. Saying it felt like acknowledging both the danger and the witnesses, those who had come before and never returned. The vibrations of the machinery seemed to intensify, almost like a heartbeat, syncing with the pounding of my own. I started inspecting the maintenance panels, flashlight trembling in my grip, knowing that any mistake could leave a permanent trace. The shadows seemed to shift closer with every step, as though drawn by the echo of my movements. Somewhere in the darkness, I thought I heard whispers, indistinct murmurs that could have been carried by the ventilation, or perhaps the pit itself. The rule was clear. Entering alone was a risk not just of physical injury, but of leaving yourself vulnerable to the unseen, to echoes of those who had been claimed by negligence, by misjudgment, by the machinery's memory. A sudden metallic clang reverberated through the pit, startling me. I froze, listening to the echo bounce across walls and girders, blending with the hum of turbines. The sound seemed almost sentient, deliberate, a response to my solitary presence. My flashlight beam flickered, and in that moment, I felt eyes, or something far more ambiguous, tracking my movements. Each shadow seemed alive, swaying and coiling, in ways the emergency lights had never revealed. The echoes of the lost, I realized, were not figurative. Their memory lingered in the vibrations, the shadows, in every whisper of the steel around me. I took a deep breath and moved carefully toward the central machinery, checking valves and switches, trying to keep my fear in check. But the pit had its own rhythm, reacting to my presence. Shadows stretched longer, moved faster, responding to the tremor of my heartbeat, the pressure of my boots against the grating. Every step felt like an intrusion into a sacred and dangerous space. I could feel that I was being catalogued, the pit remembering my solitary descent, embedding my presence into its unseen archives, alongside countless others who had dared enter alone. Halfway through the inspection, I noticed a faint glow along the far wall, a reflection from what appeared to be a maintenance panel, but the light flickered in patterns I could not interpret. The shadows responded instantly, stretching and twisting in unison, as if synchronized with some hidden consciousness within the pit. My pulse quickened. I realized then that entering without backup was not just a rule, it was survival. Alone, I was an easy target for the machinery's awareness, for the echoes that followed. Every mistake I made, every hesitation would be recorded, catalogued, and perhaps even fed upon by whatever lurked in the steel and shadows. I kept whispering the rule, letting it guide my cautious progress, and yet the whispers of the lost seemed louder, responding to my acknowledgement. The deeper I went, the more tangible the presence became. I felt it brushing against my mind, subtle vibrations that seemed to communicate awareness, a watchfulness that extended beyond human perception. The machinery hummed a little louder, the shadows pulsed in response, and I understood the magnitude of my mistake. Alone, I was vulnerable, and the echoes of past mistakes were very real, lingering in the machinery, waiting for a single misstep to claim another memory. As I completed the preliminary inspection and began my careful retreat, The air in the pit seemed thicker, almost heavier, vibrating with echoes I could not name. Shadows pooled along the edges of the catwalk, stretching unnaturally, and I felt their presence in my chest, pressing subtly but insistently against my heart. Every step back to the ladder, every glance over my shoulder, reminded me that I had trespassed into a space meant to be shared, meant to be entered with witnesses. Alone, I had triggered something, the awareness, the memory, the echoes that followed. Reaching the upper deck, I exhaled shakily, the distant hum of turbines now sounding almost like whispers. The machinery pit behind me seemed quieter but not absent of presence. I could still feel it, the echoes lingering, a subtle vibration through the floors and beams, reminding me of the lives catalogued in the shadows. I knew then that the rule was not a mere precaution. Entering the pit alone left a permanent imprint, a record in the memory of the rig that would not fade, that could follow me in subtle, unnerving ways. Even days later, when I walked past the machinery pit with a full crew, I could feel the lingering awareness pressing against me. Shadows seemed to cling closer, the hum of turbines carrying a subtle weight, a reminder that the echoes of those who entered alone never dissipated. Rule 8. Never enter the machinery pit without backup. Echoes of the lost follow you had been reinforced, carved into my consciousness with chilling clarity. Alone, I had survived, but the memory of the pit and its inhabitants, the silent, unseen observers, would follow me forever, waiting for a moment of weakness to remind me why vigilance and companionship were essential. I had always dismissed the sirens as a mere safety protocol, but Rule 9, never ignore the sirens. They know who is vulnerable became terrifyingly real one night during a maintenance sweep. The warning tones echoed faintly through the steel corridors. At first, almost melodic, but then escalated into something that vibrated through my bones. The rig's emergency system seemed alive, pulsating with urgency, and the shadows along the walls stretched unnaturally toward the sound. I froze, recognizing the eerie timbre of the alarm, realizing that it was more than a warning. It was a gauge, measuring fear, hesitation, and the vulnerability of whoever walked its halls alone. The first moments were disorienting. Every echo of the siren bounced across the steel framework, harmonizing with the hum of turbines and the faint vibration from the machinery pit below. My flashlight beam trembled as I scanned the corridor, revealing elongated shadows that seemed to move independently, drawn toward the shrill wail. I could feel the rig itself resonating with the sound, as if amplifying my own panic. The rule, whispered countless times before, now hung heavy in my mind. Every vibration, every tone, every pulse of the siren seemed attuned to me personally, cataloging my reactions, identifying weakness. I moved cautiously toward the control panels, my hands shaking, knowing that ignoring the siren would only exacerbate the rig's awareness of my vulnerability. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching along beams and conduits, seemingly anticipating my actions. My pulse raced, matching the cadence of the warning tones. I remembered the earlier lessons about heat, darkness, and open hatches, and understood that the sirens were the rig's voice, a way to highlight mistakes, measure fear, and identify those who had not fully respected the rules. A sudden clatter from the machinery pit below made me jump, the vibrations from the engines and sirens merging into a low, insistent hum. Shadows twisted along the walls, pooling into darker, more coherent shapes, as if the rig itself had eyes that watched, storing every misstep in memory. I whispered the rule aloud, trying to anchor myself. Never ignore the sirens. They know who is vulnerable. Saying it was not reassurance, it was acknowledgement. The sirens did not just warn, they remembered. They cataloged the alertness of each crew member, measuring every heartbeat, every hesitation. I cautiously navigated the corridors, flashlight slicing through the red and white emergency lights that flashed intermittently, but the shadows never ceased moving. The siren's wail seemed to chase me, resonating with the vibrations in the steel floor, amplifying the tension in the air. I could feel the rig observing, learning, and responding to my panic. Every misstep, every quickened heartbeat, Every sign of fear left an imprint, a mark that the sirens in the rig would remember. Compliance was no longer a suggestion, it was survival. Halfway down the lower deck, I encountered a flickering light above the turbine hull. Shadows danced unnaturally, elongating and coiling around the structural beams in time with the siren's wail. I realized that sound and light were connected here, woven into the rig's awareness. The sirens highlighted vulnerability, and the shadows, the darkness, cataloged it. Each pulse of the alarm felt almost tactile, pressing against my skin, vibrating through my boots, a constant reminder that the rig's memory was unrelenting and meticulous. The deeper I went, the more the sirens seemed to personalize their intensity. It was as if the rig could sense my fear, amplifying its voice to match. Every time I faltered or hesitated, the wail surged, echoing with a precision that no human system could achieve. Shadows in the corridor responded instantly, stretching and twisting, shaping themselves into forms that my mind could not fully comprehend. The rig, alive with memory and awareness, responded to the siren as a tool to identify weakness, and I understood for the first time the real danger in dismissing this rule. I reached the junction to the machinery pit and paused, feeling the siren's vibration in my chest and along my spine. The shadows twisted closer, coiling in unnatural patterns as the red emergency lights flickered. I could sense echoes of previous crew members, absorbed by the rig and memorialized in vibrations, in shadows, in the very air. Ignoring the siren would not just be negligence. It would announce vulnerability, invite the unseen to probe, catalog, and remember. My pulse pounded in my ears as I whispered the rule one more time under my breath, reaffirming its importance and my adherence. Finally, after several tense minutes, the control panels acknowledged my presence, stabilizing systems that the siren had highlighted as critical. The wail gradually subsided, but the residual vibration lingered, a ghost of the rig's awareness, a reminder that the sirens were not just alarms but sentinels of observation. Shadows clung to corners, moving subtly in response to every breath, every heartbeat. The lesson was indelible. The sirens measured, remembered, and responded. Obedience kept you safe. Vulnerability left a trace. Even now, months later, I can feel the weight of Rule 9 every time a siren wails anywhere on the rig. The shadows twist differently, the vibrations carry meaning, and the rig's awareness feels closer, more intimate. Rule 9, never ignore the sirens. They know who is vulnerable has become etched in my mind and body, a constant reminder that sound, light, and shadow are alive here, cataloging human weakness, amplifying risk, and ensuring that disobedience or inattentiveness never goes unnoticed. Survival depends on respect, vigilance, and immediate reaction. I had always taken the monitoring systems for granted, but Rule 10, never disconnect the monitoring systems. Silence invites the unknown, struck me with a bone-deep urgency that night. The rig had been unusually quiet. The familiar hum of sensors, alarms, and turbines seemed muted, almost holding its breath. I wandered the control deck, unsure why the systems had dimmed, when a fleeting thought made my skin crawl. Silence was not empty here. In the oppressive stillness, I could sense the rig watching, cataloging, waiting. Every panel, every wire, every shadow felt sharper, more attentive, as though the absence of sound gave the unseen room to grow. The moment I reached for the main monitoring console, I hesitated, recalling warnings whispered by the older crew. The silence was a lure, a testing ground for negligence. The shadows along the walls seemed heavier, stretching and curling unnaturally in the dim light, reacting to my every motion. I reminded myself, whispering under my breath, never disconnect the monitoring systems. Silence invites the unknown, hoping repetition might ward off the invisible tension pressing against me. Even as I followed the routine checks, the quiet seemed to amplify every mechanical vibration, every faint creak of steel, turning ordinary sounds into ominous signals. I traced the network of wires across the deck, checking connections, noting how the dim screens made every shadow deeper, and more purposeful. The rig had grown accustomed to being observed. When its systems fell silent, the balance shifted. Shadows that had previously lurked innocuously along corners now coiled toward me, moving in subtle, impossible ways. I realized with a tightening chest that the monitoring systems were more than eyes and ears. They were lifelines. Without them, the unseen could creep closer, charting mistakes, cataloging vulnerabilities. A sudden flicker across a panel made me jump, though no one was near. The muted lights revealed shapes, shifting unnaturally, merging and separating with movements that defied logic. I froze, letting my breath catch in my throat, listening to the faint hum of what remained active. The silence around the dimmed monitors felt almost tangible, thick with anticipation. I understood then that the rig was aware when its systems were disabled, counting on human negligence to create openings for unseen forces. Every fraction of sound was amplified. Every pause and observation was remembered. I moved cautiously along the deck, running diagnostics, keeping every screen active, every connection in check. The shadows mirrored my movements, stretching long, curling around structural beams, and sometimes pooling in corners that no light could penetrate. I felt a subtle vibration through the floorboards, like the rig's pulse, sensing that the quiet had been temporary, a test of my vigilance. The lesson from the rule was clear. Silence did not conceal. Silence invited. Disconnection of the monitors was an invitation to forces that thrived in observation and memory. As I approached the engine interface, a low, unidentifiable hum began resonating through the metal corridors. It was faint but deliberate, an auditory thread threading through the rig, connecting the shadows, the steel, and the air itself. The absence of monitoring made every vibration, every whisper, every subtle shift in the environment feel like a message aimed at me personally. I realized that previous minor oversights, like bypassing cooling systems or ignoring sirens, had left traces, but silence was different. Silence brought awareness, patience, and the unseen closer. I hesitated, flashlight tracing over instruments, aware that a single accidental disconnection could awaken more than just alarms. The shadows lengthened toward me, responding to my nervous movements, following the subtle tremor in my boots, the rise and fall of my chest. I whispered the rule again, a mantra against the growing tension. Never disconnect the monitoring systems. Silence invites the unknown. Speaking it aloud felt protective, but I knew in my gut that the rig and the unseen entities it harbored could sense the slightest doubt, cataloging every response. Hours seemed to pass as I methodically rechecked every active system, restoring minor faults and ensuring that nothing was ever left offline. The shadows followed closely, stretching and coiling along beams and cables, responding instantly to my interactions with the consoles. The faint hum of live systems reassured me, in part, but the memory of silence lingered, pressing against my mind. Even a brief lapse, a momentary disconnection, was cataloged in the rig's memory, stored by the machinery, amplified in shadows, and waiting to test my vigilance further. Finally, after meticulous checks, the control deck hummed with operational stability once more. Panels glowed steadily, alarms were responsive, and the machinery's rhythm felt familiar again. The shadows, however, remained, subtle, patient, as if recording the events that had occurred during the period of near silence. I knew that the rig's memory was permanent. The unseen had noted my vulnerability during the brief lapse. I exhaled slowly, yet the lesson had been seared into my consciousness. Compliance, vigilance, and the presence of active systems were essential for survival. Even now, the faint silence in any section of the rig sets my nerves on edge. Every shadow seems more deliberate, every vibration more meaningful. I constantly monitor panels, never allowing even a momentary lapse. Rule 10. Never disconnect the monitoring systems. Silence invites the unknown has become etched into every movement, every glance, every decision. The rig observes through sound, light, and shadow, and silence is the only invitation it needs to awaken forces that no human should encounter alone. Vigilance is survival. Disconnection is a risk written into memory, irreversible and eternal. From the moment I stepped into the control deck that night, I felt the weight of Rule 11. Never question the final rule. The last rule is the one nobody survives, heavier than any rule I had followed before. The rig was quiet in a way that screamed warning. Shadows pooled in corners, elongated along beams, and the hum of machinery carried a subtle, almost conscious rhythm. I could sense every previous error, every lapse in vigilance, pressing down on me as if the rig itself were counting, cataloging, waiting for me to act. This rule, unlike any other, carried the sense of inevitability. There was no room for negotiation, no margin for skepticism, and questioning it was impossible without consequence. I moved slowly along the catwalk, every step deliberate, aware that the shadows shifted with my movement. The previous rules had prepared me, but this final one had a gravity that defied understanding. I whispered the rule under my breath, trying to ground myself in the clarity of its instruction. Yet even as I repeated the words, a chill ran through my spine. The rig's presence was omnipresent, felt in the vibrations underfoot, in the way the shadows seemed to lean toward me, and in the faint hum of machinery that carried the memory of every crew member who had come before. The lights flickered, and I realized that the rig had noticed my hesitation. Every instinct screamed to retreat, but something compelled me forward, deeper into the heart of the control deck. The shadows coiled along walls and beams, twisting in ways that defied light and physics, as though they were alive with memory. Each flicker of the emergency lights cast shapes that seemed almost human, and I could feel the lingering presence of those who had failed this final test. The rule was simple in wording, yet impossible to fully comprehend until you were standing at its threshold, facing the inevitable. I reached the main console, the screens glowing faintly, showing readouts that no human should be able to interpret. My hands trembled as I hovered over the controls, feeling the shadows press closer, subtly yet insistently. The rig seemed to pulse, aware of my every hesitation, every thought that crossed my mind. I realized with a creeping terror that questioning this rule was already dangerous. Even considering the consequences felt like an act of defiance. The rule existed not merely to instruct, but to control, to catalog obedience, and to ensure the unseen forces remained undisturbed. A sudden vibration ran through the floor beneath me, low but insistent, reverberating in time with the subtle pulse I could feel through my chest. Shadows coiled closer, merging with other shadows, as if multiple presences were observing and weighing my every decision. The rig remembered every moment of defiance, every lapse in attention, storing it in its memory like a ledger of survival and failure. I could feel the past crew members' experiences pressing against the edges of my consciousness, warnings etched into the air itself. The final rule was not a suggestion. It was the rig's assertion of absolute control. I whispered the words of the rule again, almost a mantra. Never question the final rule. The last rule is the one nobody survives. The repetition gave me a fleeting sense of safety, a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness and awareness. But even as I recited it, I felt the presence of the rig grow stronger, the shadows lengthen, and the air thicken with expectation. Every instinct screamed that this was the point of no return, where hesitation or doubt could fracture reality, and the rig could claim another memory, another trace. Moving along the control deck, I noticed subtle changes. Shadows now moved against the light, converging, twisting in impossible ways, forming shapes that hinted at recognition, awareness, and judgment. I realized the rig was alive in its own way, not through mechanics, but through memory, observation, and consequence. Every previous rule had built up to this. Every test of obedience, every cataloged error, every vibration and shadow had prepared me for the final reckoning. The unseen forces thrived on compliance and curiosity alike, and this last rule existed to enforce boundaries I could not hope to fully comprehend. I reached the far end of the deck, where the main viewport overlooked the churning ocean below. The shadows pooled in the corners, pressing subtly against walls and ceiling, watching, cataloging, waiting. The final rule's weight was almost unbearable. My chest tightened, and the machinery's hum seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. I understood then why it was the last survival depended on total obedience, not comprehension. To question, even silently, was to invite observation, to feed the rig's memory with traces of defiance. A subtle vibration ran through the deck once more, sending a shiver down my spine. I realized that every shadow, every sound, every flicker of light was aware of me in a way that defied explanation. The rig had cataloged my past mistakes, measured my fear, and now at the threshold of the final rule, I understood that its patience was absolute. The rule existed to assert inevitability, to remind anyone who dared that the last boundary was final, and survival was as much about perception as compliance. I exhaled shakily, aware that the shadows seemed closer, more deliberate, almost sentient in their observation. The air felt thick with anticipation, as though the rig itself waited for my next action, measuring every blink, every step, every heartbeat. I whispered the rule one final time, a quiet acknowledgement: never question the final rule. The last rule is the one nobody survives. Even as I said it, I knew that no amount of acknowledgement could fully protect me from the weight of the unknown that lurked in the shadows and memory of the rig. And yet, as I stood there, watching the dark waters churn beneath the rig, I couldn't shake the feeling that the last rule was more than a guideline. It was a warning, a promise, and an assertion that some boundaries are eternal. The shadows pressed ever closer, the vibrations through the steel grew more insistent, and I understood with a cold certainty that the rig's memory was eternal, its awareness absolute, and the final rule was not meant to be broken, but silently, hauntingly, it was impossible to ignore. I turned away from the viewport, knowing that every glance back would feel like scrutiny, that every shadow might carry the memory of every crew member who had come before. I moved cautiously, heart hammering, yet a small part of me knew the truth that the rule obscured. Survival was not guaranteed, obedience was not protective, and the last rule was a boundary no one had ever truly crossed and lived to describe. The rig's memory, its awareness, and the unseen forces it harbored would persist long after anyone left the deck. As I walked toward the exit, the shadows lingering along the walls, I realized that the final rule was not just a rule. It was the rig itself, embodied in obedience, in memory, and in the inevitability of what waited for anyone daring to question it. Even now, as I write this, I feel its weight pressing down, a subtle vibration beneath my feet, the flicker of shadows just at the corner of my vision. The last rule is final, absolute, and eternal, and the consequences of questioning it remain unknowable, waiting for the next moment of hesitation, the next trace of doubt.